say.
Okay, good morning, hearing section. We're going to get going in a minute. Okay, Steve and... Okay, top of the morning. It seems a little bit inappropriate for someone from Maine to be welcoming us all to Georgia, but on behalf of the hearing section, welcome. And go Sox. Great game last night. For those on the audio, I'm Terry Stockwell, the now new chair of the hearing section, and call the meeting to order. We need to approve the agenda, and I do want to note there was one item that did not make the final agenda. It's the approval of the 2014 Area 1A tax seasonal distribution, and without an objection, I'd like to make that agenda item number 5 after, because it is an action item. Are there any other changes to the agenda? Seeing none, consider the agenda approved. Are there any? If anybody's had a chance to read the proceedings, are there any comments or changes to the proceedings? Seeing none, consider the proceedings approved. Are there any members of the audience who would like to comment on agenda items that are not on the agenda? All right. Melissa, looks like you're up on agenda item 4, the 2012 Management FMP Review and Compliance.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will now go over the Atlantic Sea Herring FMP Review and State Compliance for the 2012 fishing year. Okay, the graph's not up yet, but otherwise you will see a graph. First is the review of the stock status. Atlantic herring is currently managed as a single stock from Maine to New Jersey, although there is evidence of 2 distinct spawning units. The most recent stock assessment by NOAA Fisheries was completed in 2012, which included data up to 2011. The assessment update concluded that Atlantic herring is not overfished, but is in fact rebuilt relative to the current target spawning stock biomass level of 157,000 metric tons. The spawning stock biomass in 2011 was estimated to be 518,000 metric tons. As you can see, the spawning stock biomass trend has recovered since the crash in the late 1970s. The spike in recent years is due to a strong cohort in 2009. Atlantic herring is not experiencing overfishing. The fishing mortality rate in 2011 is 0.14, which is below the threshold of 0.27. Again, this was primarily due to the strong cohort in 2009. The Atlantic herring is a commercial fishery. Less than 1% is taken by the recreational fishery. Over the time series from 1965 to 2012, annual landings by the United States Atlantic herring fleet generally increased and averaged about 57,000 metric tons, or 125.4 million pounds. In 2012, the landings totaled nearly 86,000 metric tons, with the majority taken by trawls and purse seine gears. So this is how the 189 million pounds landed in 2012 broke down by state. Maine landed 67% with nearly 88,000 metric tons. Massachusetts landed 27% with 36,000 metric tons. Rhode Island came next with almost 5%. And then New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut each landed less than 1% of the coastwide total. Combined, Maine and Massachusetts accounted for 94% of the commercial Atlantic herring landings. And this is based on the state compliance reports. So this is a list of the FMP documents. I didn't include all the specific addenda for Amendment 1, but for Amendment 2, we have Addendum 1, Addendum 2, Addendum 5, as of 2012. So the management measures required in this FMP are spawning area restrictions, prohibition of landings in a management area once the subquota has been reached, prohibition of landings of herring to an internal waters processing operation. There are monitoring requirements. There's a weekly reporting of daily landings in order to manage the quota in a timely manner. And then states have to provide an annual report on any mealing activity. Also, Area 1A has seasonal splitting, specifications process, triggers, and spawning regulations. The plan review team found that all states had management programs consistent with the FMP. So request for de minimis status. Amendment 1 provided the criteria for de minimis status. A state must demonstrate that its most recent commercial landings is less than 1% of the coastwide landings for the past 2 years. So New York has requested de minimis status. The plan review team recommends to the board to grant de minimis status to New York based on their most recent commercial landings, which meet the criteria. So in 2011, they only caught 30,700 pounds. In 2012, it was 85,000 pounds. And since 1991, their landings have averaged 0.4% of the coastwide landings. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Melissa. Are there any questions for Melissa? Dr. Pierce.
Not so much a question, but I'd like to add some information that is important in light of the fact that Melissa did take the time to give some historical information on herring landings. And what I'm about to say is relevant to discussions we'll have in a little bit about spawning on Georges Bank, Nantucket Shoals. And you'll see from the figure that she had put up on the screen showing spawning stock biomass over the years. Back in the 1970s, late 1970s, and then the early 1980s, spawning stock biomass was very, very low. At that time, we had a New England Council plan that established some quotas for sea herring, very low quotas that essentially shut the U.S. fishery down at that time. The high mortality previous to that was due to foreign fishing, principally. The fleets were fishing off of our coast, up and down our coast, fishing on Georges Bank. And the reason, and part of that effort, which was on Georges Bank, was on spawning concentrations of sea herring. And the Northeast Fisheries Science Center scientists made it very clear at that time, back in the 1970s, early 80s, that the reasons why the Georges Bank herring stock collapsed was fishing on spawning aggregations by the foreign fleets on Georges Bank. So for many years we had a lack of fish on Georges Bank. Then I and others at the time witnessed the slow return of herring to Georges Bank, and that was due to the fact that there was successful herring spawning on Nantucket Shoals, nearby Nantucket Shoals, and the consensus view of the U.S. scientists was that that spawning on Nantucket Shoals seeded Georges Bank, and as a consequence, the bank came back. So Nantucket Shoals spawning, Georges Bank spawning has been extremely in certain areas, and that's, again, it's relevant to our discussions later on about spawning on Georges Bank and needed protection. And then one final point I'll make, because Melissa put up the 2012 herring landings by state, noting Maine and Massachusetts and Rhode Island, principally somewhat in New Hampshire and New Jersey. Just for the record, we do have a fixed gear, purse seine gear only area that is in the Gulf of Maine, and that particular closure does dramatically impact the landings by midwater pier trawlers, with many of them being out of the Massachusetts ports. So if that closure was not in place, I suspect landings in Massachusetts would have gone up rather dramatically. I'm not saying the closure shouldn't be there. It is warranted, but that's a reason why, maybe the principal reason why there is such a shift of landings to the state of Maine as opposed to the state of Massachusetts. Of course, the state of Maine has a larger fleet anyways, so that does contribute to the higher landings, but I wanted to highlight that fact. A fixed gear, purse seine gear only area in place for much of the year in the inshore portion of the Gulf of Maine that directs effort from Massachusetts fishing in the Gulf of Maine to the Georges Bank area. So, just for the record.
Are there any other comments for the record? Questions? This is an action item, so I'll be looking for a motion. Doug?
I move we approve the Herring FMP review and approve New York's de minimis request.
Seconded by Jim.
I've been corrected that it should be we accept the FMP review. Oh, it's up there. Thank you very much.
Is there a need to caucus? Okay, I'll read the motion into the record is move to accept the 2012 FMP review and approve the de minimis request from New York. Motion made by Mr. Grout and seconded by Mr. Gilmore. Is there any objection to this motion? Seeing none, consider it approved. The next action item we have is a 2014 Area 1A TAC seasonal distribution. Doug, I believe you have a motion.
Yes, I have a motion, Mr. Chair. Thank you. This is something that we do at the annual meeting every year to set up things for the 1A fishery. And I move to allocate the 2014 Area 1A TAC seasonally with 72.8% available for June through September and 27.2% allocated from October through December. The fishery will close when 92% of the seasonal period's quota has been harvested, and underages from June through September may be rolled into the October to December period.
We'll give Kate a minute to catch up with you.
No, it's when 92% of the seasonal period's quota correct.
Is that your motion? Correct, Doug?
Correct.
Is there a second? Second by Bill Adler. Is there any section discussion on the motion on the board?
I don't.
Jeff, you'd like to ask a question?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members of the section. My question is, the specifications allow for rolling over any unused quota in year 3 in this fishery, and my question as chairman of the advisors is, will there be any unused quota either from the 1A or 3, which are now closed upon review when we have all the data? Is there potential for some quota rollover in the future? Has that anybody started to consider how we mechanically do that yet? But even if it's a few tons, I think we'd like to see it as an industry moved over if possible. Thank you.
I think that's in the Addendum 6 provisions, and I believe it's any underages from this year will be rolled over into 2015.
That's right, Mr. Grout. That's why I just wanted to make sure that we don't lose track of that provision. Thank you.
And section members, remember that it takes a year for the accounting to go through, which is why there's a time delay. Are there any other questions or comments to the motion on the board? Okay, I'm going to read the motion into the record. Move to allocate the 2014 Area 1A tax seasonally with 72.8% available through June through September and 27.2% allocated October to December. The fishery will close when 92% of the seasonal period quota has been harvested. Underages from June to September may be rolled into the November to December period. Motion made by Mr. Grout and seconded by Mr. Adler. I correct myself. Thank you, Joe. It'd be October to December period. Is there a need to caucus? Are there any objections to the motion on the board? Seeing none, this is a final action and consider it approved. Melissa, we're up to agenda item 7, which is the update on, or 6, the technical committee report on the Georges Bank Nantucket Shoal spawning study. That's Renee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Renee Zobel, the TC Chair for Atlantic Herring. We were asked by the section to come back with some more information on the Georges Bank Nantucket Shoal spawning study and information around the spawning in that area. As a little bit of background, February 2012, this was discussed by the section, the need for protections for Georges Bank Nantucket Shoals area, and they asked us to do a few things. And we produced a committee report, and the section came back and requested expansion of that report and highlighted a few issues in the, that's fine, you can go to the next one. In the TC report, we were looking for feedback on goals and objectives, that comment that there would be potential relocation of fishing effort inshore, and that we would like to take 3-year study of offshore spawning, because we don't know much about the Georges Bank Nantucket Shoal spawning stock. We don't know much about those fish out there and their activities, and that we were in need of long-term funding. Funds are obviously hard to come by. So section requested specific budget needs, and alternative offshore sampling measures, and management options for offshore spawning areas or potential management options. As the technical committee, we had this discussion and produced a report, and we've laid out specific budget needs for what we would need in order to complete the study annually for Georges Bank Nantucket Shoals. Alternative offshore sampling measures were not provided at this time. The biologists who would be producing sampling measures indicated that they would need time to do that. Time is money, so that funding was definitely something that would be needed. And without the 3-year study, management options for offshore spawning areas we can't recommend at this time. So, yeah. On the next slide, you'll see what was requested from the states of Maine and Massachusetts as far as what it would cost to fund these offshore sampling efforts. Being the representative from New Hampshire myself, our sampling is taken care of by Maine and Massachusetts. We don't have the personnel or the lab in order to process samples, hence we are 0. We're rolled into the other 2 states. So that gives a good indication of what we would be looking for each year for this study on Georges Bank Nantucket Shoal. And comments from the TC, what we were still looking for is clear goals and objectives for the offshore study. We reviewed this the last time around when Matt was here, but under Amendment 2, I believe one of the comments or one of the points is that we don't want to direct, in synopsis, direct more fishing pressure inshore because we feel that's the more vulnerable component of the Atlantic herring fishery. If we have a closure in offshore waters, that potentially could redirect efforts inshore. So we were looking for a little bit of clarity in goals and objectives from the section to consider when we were looking at these things. There is concern about using state resources for a study in federal waters, using state monies for that. And it's been suggested that we use IJ funds for the spawning studies. Each of the states, that was taken away, and now we get it back. But each of the states have ongoing sampling programs that are funded by those monies, and there really isn't extra resources available unless those funding sources were increased. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee and the TC. Pat?
Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's cut right to the quick on this thing. Let's go to the last three line items. And actually, the last item, we talked about the Interjurisdictional Fishing Act funding. And if there aren't any funds available for that, then the question begs to be asked, can the Fed support this effort? Because it's an offshore issue. It impacts our states, but it's an offshore issue. So can we get those two questions addressed? Funding Interjurisdictional Fishery Act, if there's any. No. If there is some, then let's see what we can do. And second is, can the federal government come forward with anything? And if not, I would move that we table this until a later date, Mr. Chairman.
Bill?
My question to the technical committee had to do with the memo. How important is this transporting fish offshore for sampling? They were concerned about whether they could get the proper, I guess, identification. How serious is that particular part?
So in response, sorry, I'm loud there. In response to that, in order to process the samples properly for the GSI and the IGNAF stages, they have to be within 24 hours, and they can't be frozen. So it's incredibly important.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, thank you. So in other words, and it's 24 hours, is that possible? Can they go out, get the samples, be back in within 24 hours, non-frozen, in order to get an accurate scientific thing? Is that doable?
That's part of what we would like to look at with sampling protocols. There are some offshore boats here represented today. There are times when that would absolutely be possible, and then there are times when that would be very difficult, depending on when the boats are landing and when they're fishing.
David?
I appreciate the obstacles that the technical committee had to try to overcome, and they are significant, and you've identified them. Additional funds needed for the states to do the work in the ports relative to sampling of spawning fish, similar to the work that's being done now in the Gulf of Maine. So that's clearly a factor. I think we've reached the point where it's necessary for the section to take a slightly different approach in light of what the technical committee has told us, in light of the fact that we have this need for a study, 3-year study. That's too long. 3 years is too long as far as I'm concerned. And I think we know enough about herring spawning on Georges Bank for us to move forward, but not by ourselves. I think we really do need to have more investment by the New England Fishery Management Council, and it might be investment that's fairly easy to get, since the chairman of the New England Council is sitting before us, Terry Stockwell. I think it's necessary for us to now enlist some more people, some more resources to assist us with this very important endeavor. I indicated before in my earlier comments that Georges Bank can collapse. Yeah, it was due to the heavy fishing by the foreign fleets, and the fishing by our domestic fleets is nowhere near what it was during the times when the fleets were on our shores, but still, spawning aggregations do exist. Many of them are, the locations of those aggregations are known. I think it's necessary for us to get some more firepower enlisted. So I would make a motion, Mr. Chairman, and I've given it to staff, because I don't want this issue to die. I don't want this to be put on the back burner and then left there until the stove goes cold. This is an important issue, and it is an issue that's very relevant to federal activities and to New England Council management of sea herring offshore specifically. So I would move that the New England Fishery Management Council be requested to have its Scientific and Statistical Committee / Plan Development Team work with the ASMFC Atlantic Herring Technical Committee to identify what's known about Georges Bank, Nantucket shoal spawning, and provide an offshore sampling protocol for the purposes of protecting spawning herring.
Motion made by Dr. Pierce and second by David Borden. Discussion. Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly support the motion. In looking at recent history, a number of years we were not harvesting our quota in Area 3, and now we are. And so I think that this adds additional importance historically to what Dave has brought up, and it's something we have to be careful of, and I think this is a logical next step.
Just a question for David. Are you, seeing as we're coming up on setting council priorities, are you suggesting that the council prioritize this? And if so, you may want to modify your verbiage.
I am suggesting that it be a priority C-hearing issue for the council. Let's see.
The way I read the motion, it could sit in a hole for a long time.
Well, okay, move that the, all right, so let's see, someone is inserting some language. Let's see if it works. As a priority issue. Yes, that's a good insert. Whoever did that, thank you. Okay.
It's magic. Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a TC chair, the AP chair, I just want to point out that the advisory panel hasn't been asked to consider this issue yet. And as a member of the Herring Committee, now that I'm a Mid-Atlantic Council member, I wonder if it's premature to identify this as a priority before you have the technical review, because I think we're already at twice the spawning stock biomass on the resource right now. So, and I think SSB considers the state of spawning activity in these areas. So that's just a question mark. I think there's other things that we might be able to do with scarce resources at the council. I appreciate the opportunity to say that. Thank you.
David.
Well, Jeff raises a good point regarding the status of the resource, and indeed the resource is in good shape. However, I'm always influenced by the fact that there still is this question of the impact of concentrated fishing on spawning aggregations, and also the impact of focused fishing on the availability on causing local depletion. All right. Even though the resource is in good shape, and I'm not sure it's in as good a shape as what the assessment indicates, but we have it and we use it. I think there's enough reason for us to be concerned about what could happen to this resource with spawning, with focused fishing on spawning fish, with the importance of George's Bank to the offshore fleet, that in the best interest of the resource and in the future of the offshore fishing fleet that is dependent upon that herring, we need to be as aggressive as we can possibly be to protect those fish. And this would at least be a step in the right direction, working with the council that has the authority. And of course, the advisors, council advisors, ASMFC advisors would be involved in those discussions to help us move it forward in a priority way that would be sensitive to what the industry knows. Not just what we know through scientific research, but what the industry knows.
Thank you, Dr. Pierce. I'm not arguing against the motion. In fact, when I spoke to Terry earlier this morning, this is exactly what I suggested that the board consider, the section consider doing. So thank you for your response. Appreciate it.
Is there further discussion to the motion on the board? I'll read it in the record. I'll move that the New England Fishery Management Council will be requested to have its SSC PDT work with the ASMFC Atlantic Herring Technical Committee as a priority issue to identify what's known about George's Bank, Nantucket Shoal spawning, and provide an offshore sampling protocol for the purposes of protecting spawning herring. Motion made by Dr. Pierce and seconded by Mr. Borden. My sense is should this motion pass, that Bob will be writing a letter to the New England Council. The Executive Committee meets a week from Wednesday. The Council meets last week of the month.
Just real quick, Terry, I think, technically this is a recommendation to the Policy Board to approve a letter going off to the Council. It's a technicality, but just to keep the process whole, we probably should change the wording to reflect that.
Thank you. Do I need to reread it, Joe? No. Move that the Herring Section recommend to the Policy Board to send a letter to the Council requesting to have its SSC PDT work with the ASMFC Atlantic Herring Technical Committee as a priority issue to identify what's known about Georges Bank Nantucket Shoal spawning and provide an offshore sampling protocol for the purposes of protecting spawning herring. Motion made by Dr. Pierce and seconded by Mr. Borden and perfected by Bob Beal. Is there an objection to the motion on the board? Seeing none, this motion will be forwarded to the Policy Board. Melissa, it's update on the New England Fisheries Management Council Amendment 5 and Framework 3.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is just a brief update on the New England Fishery Management Council's Atlantic Herring FMP and their actions that are paralleling ours. So first, Framework 3, this is for the river herring and shad catch caps. Catch caps in the Atlantic herring fishery. So in September, the Council selected its final measures for the 2014 and 2015 catch caps. The final submission of the framework document after a preliminary NIMS review will be forwarded towards the end of this year, and implementation about halfway through 2014. So this is relevant to Amendment 5, which is still awaiting final rule and implementation. The Council will decide priorities by 2014 at the end of this year. In the meantime, the Council will be considering a request for emergency action to address the haddock bycatch concerns in its next meeting. So that's just a very brief run-through of the Council update. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Melissa. Are there? Bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's at this point. I had a question when I learned that it had been agreed by, or it had been approved to not open 1B until May. And in the past, 1B, I believe, always opened January 1, just like 2 and 3. And the section never discussed this, to my knowledge. And I don't know how come they jumped and decided that they're going to keep 1B closed until May. I don't know why, and I don't know where that came from.
I think Jeff has an answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, it came from the recommendations of the Herring Committee and with the support of the Herring AP in New England to delay opening of Area 1B. Since that time, there's been some industry people that have asked, how come we're doing that? One implication is if there's mackerel up there in the wintertime, and you're only going to have 2,000 pounds of herring, that's a problem. You can't go fishing for mackerel because of the amount of herring we normally catch in the mackerel fishery. So it was vetted here. It was discussed as one of the things that the New England Council did, but I think there are some people who are questioning that now, Mr. Adler, but it was reviewed. It was a recommendation from both the Herring Committee and the APs, both there and here, and this section when the specifications were approved.
Are there any additional questions for Melissa? Okay. Next agenda item is election of a vice chair. Dave?
Move to nominate Richie White for vice chair.
Motion's been made. Is there a second? Seconded by Pat Augustine. Pat?
And a motion to close nominations and cast one vote for our new vice chairman.
Congratulations, Richie. Doug?
Before we adjourn, I have to apologize. I did a poor job of proofreading the original motion that I made concerning the 1A specifications, and there's one word that needs to be changed in that, and if you start with 72% available, it says through June, it should be from June. And I'm sorry I didn't catch that before. I was trying to edit on the fly and I missed that one word. But if I don't know how you want to handle it, but
Is there an objection to the perfection? We all set, Joe? Okay. Consider it perfected. Is there any other business to come before the hearing session? Seeing none, this section is adjourned.